Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Messianic Bible Study with me, Zeli. Forgive my voice sound. I have been sort of getting over a cold the last week or so, and so I have a little bit of a tickled throat, and you might have been able to tell last week because I was out of it last week. And this week is a lot better in terms of my cognitive functioning, but my throat is still tickled. So let's get started. Today, we're going to continue in Exodus 20. And I wanted to get to Exodus 20 last week because this is the beginning of the Ten Commandments, which is really exciting. I read a commentary by, what was his name? Meredith Kline on Deuteronomy, which was interesting because he began with like the first quarter of a book. It's a small book, but the first quarter of the book is about the Ten Commandments. And it's really interesting because it actually talks about the middle of the commandments, which is the fourth one, which don't ask me how he came to that conclusion, but it's the conclusion that he came to. The fourth commandment is the middle of the commandments, probably because these last few are very short. But the idea here is that in the ancient covenants, because the Decalogue actually is in the pattern of an ancient treaty, not the same kind, not the suzerain vassal treaty that I have been talking about with the Exodus story, a different kind of treaty. And in those sorts of treaties, you would have text on either side, and then in the middle, you'd have the seal of the king stamped right in the middle. And that was the seal of approval. That was the sort of, you could say, the sign of divine authority. And if you changed that seal, then you were saying that this king doesn't actually have authority here. I don't recognize his authority to give me laws and stuff like that. And what Meredith Kline was saying was the Sabbath is that seal. And this is for a few different reasons, partly because, it's in approximately the middle of the Decalogue, but also because the Sabbath is the one that whenever it's repeated, it says it will be a sign to you that you are sanctified to God, which is interesting. But we'll get into that. First, let's begin. Exodus 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, and you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, You have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with them, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it. Pardon me. Pardon. So the Ten Commandments. Classically, and I say classically colloquially because really classically doesn't mean this. Classically means the oldest possible form of whatever it is that I'm talking about, and this is not the oldest possible form, but classically or traditionally, Christians like to break up the law into three parts: the civil, the ceremonial, and the moral. Typically, and this is a distinction that's never made in the Bible. It's sort of just made up. And, it might be reasonably made up because, like, yeah, certain laws deal with how you govern a people, like in court or something like that. Do not bear false witness. That's a judicial sort of commandment or law. Certain laws have to deal with ceremonial stuff when you go to the temple, how you perform sacrifices, who's clean, unclean, and all that sort of stuff. And certain laws seem to be dealing more with moral stuff as opposed to non-moral stuff. Like, let's say a non-moral law would be, in order to take the census, everybody has to give the government half a shekel of silver. That seems like a non-moral law or an amoral law. Or when you're eating meat, don't eat the shank bone or the bone from the hip socket. That seems to be another amoral law. But the thing about the law is that doesn't work. All of it's moral. God doesn't just arbitrarily make up stuff and then tell people to do things just to see how silly he can make them look. Even though he says that sometimes. He says, You're a peculiar people to me, therefore wear funny things. He says that sometimes. But even then, there is a moral reason behind it. And I think we forget about this, or we sort of get this mixed up in our heads because we think moral equals practical in one way or another. Moral, sorry, moral equals practical. What that means is if in order to say that something is moral, you have to find some sort of practical reason it helps somebody. So murder, that's easy. That's a moral law. Why? Because if you murder somebody, you're not helping them. What about theft? That's a moral law. So if you steal something from somebody, that's not helping them. You want to not do that. Perform a sacrifice if you do steal something. Well, now that's a ceremonial law. Why? Because it's not helping anybody. All you're doing is giving an animal to God. And God doesn't need your help. He doesn't need your animals. He just tells you to do that because of some sort of arbitrary thing that he made up. If you steal somebody, if you steal something, give 5 times what you stole back to the person. Well, now it's a bit tricky. Is that moral or ceremonial? It's helping somebody. It's moral, but it's ceremonial or civil. How is it civil? Because the court has to order this. Okay. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Is that moral? Oh, yeah, it's moral. Is it civil? Doesn't seem to be civil because you can't really enforce that. Is it ceremonial? Doesn't seem to be ceremonial. So it's got to only be moral. But it's entirely in your heart. That's what coveting is. It's a heart command. So now you have to expand the definition of moral. So it includes heart commands. So, like, you go to Leviticus 19:17, and God says, don't hate your brother in your heart. So that's another moral law. But then Jesus says, oh, well, we'll get into this, but essentially the trifurcation of the law is not easily broken up into those pieces. And the reason for this is because all of them are moral laws. Because let's talk about ceremonial laws. They have to do with the cleansing of the body, of rituals and washings and all that sort of stuff. How is that moral? Well, because God made us spiritual, physical beings. And in order for us to draw near to God, we need to be clean. So it's part of the kindness to God. It's like buying your wife flowers is a moral thing, although it's not necessary. It's a moral thing. Well, sometimes it is necessary, but presenting your offerings to God is something that, yeah, you're not going to like feed the homeless or whatever with that, but it's moral because you are worshiping God properly. And we forget that worship of God is a type of morality. What about the judge shall judge justly? Well, that's a civil law, but it's also moral. The king shall write his own law, so that governed by the priest, so that the king can always have the Torah before him. That's moral, obviously, but it's civil at the same time. But then it's also ceremonial because it shows preferential treatment to the priests, who presumably, if you sin, you bring an offering to them. So it's not easily broken down into those 3 parts. It's very muddy when it comes to those parts. Essentially, the entire Bible is a morality book. Whether it's talking about case studies, which we've talked a little bit about in Genesis already, whether it's talking about direct commands, whether it's talking about wisdom literature, whether it's talking about the proper way to approach God, all of those have to do with morality. Every single thing in the Bible is some sort of ethical code. All of it's morality. There's not a single bit of it that's not morality. All of it's moral law. None of it is only ceremonial or civil. Just get that out of your head. That doesn't exist. It's entirely made up. And it's also very young. It's a young idea. People, a lot of times, they'll point to like Aquinas or Augustine because they had some sort of tripartite law theory, but they didn't break it down into moral, civil, ceremonial. That is a product of the Reformation, which, Reformation, that's a thing that happened. And a lot of people find it to be a very good thing. But that doesn't mean that the Reformation had all the answers, and it doesn't mean that the Reformation, in everything that they did, were going back to some sort of original way of thinking about things. So this tripartite law theory, being a product of the Reformation, did not exist in Paul's day. And the only way you can trace back its ancestry is if you go through Catholicism in Aquinas' day or Augustine's day, where they talked about the tripartite law, but they had a different version of it that Luther, Calvin, and them, they just oversimplified it. Now, I want to be fair to them, of course, because maybe they saw something that I'm missing, but from what I can see, that way of thinking about the law is entirely made up. So let's continue. You can see why I'm coughing. So of course Moses goes up the mountain and he brings Aaron somewhat up the mountain, but everyone else has to stay at the bottom of the mountain and not touch it at all. This is right after God said, I will give you my law. And the people said, everything you say, we will do. They're entering into the covenant with God. Now, these people, they already have a covenant with God. How do we know? Well, because they're descendants of Abraham. They're part of the Abrahamic covenant. So this law that's being given to them is not, you could say, some sort of entirely new thing. They don't, I'm going to be careful when I say this, but at this point in time, they don't need this law because they already have the promises of God. The reason that they're being given this law is because they want to draw near to God even closer. Abraham didn't have the temple that he could visit whenever he wanted. God would appear to him sometimes in sort of mystical experiences. And it was not something that Abraham could, like, he just wanted to know whether or not to do something. So he goes to the priest and does the Urim and the Thummim. That's something you could do with the temple. That's not something you can do if you're just Abraham. There are benefits for having the law for the people. And there are, like, beyond just the very fact that God is showing them his character and his love for them by giving them the wisdom, divine wisdom of the laws of morality. That's what God is giving them. This is the covenant he's making with them. And it's not a new covenant. It is an extension of the Abrahamic covenant. Because they already have a covenant with him. God is extending it now. Yeah, it's sort of a new covenant, but it's not categorically different. It's building on top of the old Abrahamic covenant. So God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's commandment 1. You shall have no other gods before me. So that's commandment 1. And the reason for this, the Catholics actually see this a little differently. They think that you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself a carved image, and all of that sort of stuff is one commandment, which is do not worship foreign gods. They sort of sum it up in that one phrase. The Jews and some Protestants, they see, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me as one commandment. That's the first commandment. And I agree with them. And the reason is because of how these ancient covenants worked. That would have been the beginning of this Decalogue covenant. So I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, who's that? Remember, we were talking about, well, there's this angel that was there. Well, the angel brought them out. No, it was God. It was entirely God. The angel was in the cloud, but God was in the cloud. So who was it? Is this guy? This guy that's making the covenant with the people. It is the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't get me confused with someone else, is what he's saying. Don't go worship other gods who may think did one thing or another for you. You just remember that I defeated all the other gods in Egypt. You're not going to find more powerful gods than those gods that have had such a stranglehold on Egypt for millennia, so to speak, according to how they would have been thinking about it. And God says, I didn't even have to do anything. I just went in there and I just, like, they had no power. All of them, they just bowed to me. I just went in there and took you out. Which he says in a later chapter too. He says, what other God has gone into a people to pluck out a peculiar people from that people, from the midst of that nation, from the midst of those gods, and just took them out? And the answer is no one. That doesn't happen, at least not in their histories. And even today, that just doesn't happen. It has to be something that's done organically. So God is saying, you shall have no one before me, because I am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I am the one who broke your chains. No one else has done that. So the reason that this is the first commandment is because we have to recognize that he is God. There is no other God. He is the one who saves us and brings us out of our bondage. And that really is the beginning of wisdom. That's the beginning of all morality. One thing I like to say when I talk to atheists is religious people have a monopoly on morality. And this is true. And the reason I say this is because the technical definition of a monopoly is an entity that has sole production and distribution powers. Now, an atheist might say, well, I'm a perfectly good and moral person. And you're like, sure, okay. I'm not saying that you can't be, but I am saying that you didn't make up your morality. You got it from somewhere. And you got it from Christianity. You got it from religion. And the reason for this is because if you don't have a God, you don't. Now, I'm defining religion in a peculiar way. The way I'm defining religion in general, broadly speaking, is religion is an ordered metaphysical realm. That's what a religion is. And the reason for this is because you could be a superstitious atheist, meaning you don't believe in, you do believe in a metaphysical realm. This would be like a Sam Harris, for instance, but it's not ordered. There are ghosts and stuff, but they don't really like, and they may have some ability to do stuff in this world, but there's no king over them. There's no God. Or you could even say there's no universal principle that governs all of reality. And this universal principle would be the thing that you would appeal to if you were trying to make a case for a particular moral system. And for Christians and Jews, this universal principle, this entity would be a person, and the person is God. Now, the reason that religious people have a monopoly on morality, or religious thinking, the category of religion has a monopoly on morality, is because only a governed metaphysical God or an ordered metaphysical realm can or has the authority to give us morality. We can't spontaneously produce morality. That's just not something we can do. Now, you could say that you could just say something is right or wrong, but unless you have the power to enforce it, then it doesn't matter. Not only that, but unless you have the power to enforce it for all time, for all peoples, then your morality is no better than the other person who has come up and had an equal amount of power to you or more. So, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they have very similar gods, slightly different, don't really like each other all that much. Which one is superior? Which one has the authority to give the other one moral dictates? Now you could say whichever one's in power. Okay, well, at some point one of them is in power, at some point another one's in power. What about the Persians? Then they rise to power. Does that mean they're the correct people when it comes to morality? Well, you have a bit of a problem because essentially what you're saying is whoever has control of the world is the one who has moral authority, which means you are saying something very true and something that nobody wants to say if you are thinking morally. And the true thing that you are saying is what was the phrase? It's a Marxist phrase, and essentially, oh yeah, might makes right. Might makes right. That's what you're saying. He who has the power gets to make the rules. Now, the problem with that phrase is it's actually true. He who has the power gets to make the rules. The problem is you that doesn't work in the human realm. That can only work if there's a divine realm. If God exists, he is the powerful one. Might makes right. He's the one who gets to make all the rules. He invented the world and he created the world according to his governing principles, which just so happen to be called morality while we're here. If none of that exists, then you just have people doing the exact same thing that we suppose God does. And so Americans, we have the biggest military in the world. What does that mean? It means we are right. Now, the problem that we have with this is anybody who believes in some sort of Marxist theory and generally atheism, they're not going to come out and say that just because somebody is oppressing another person, that means they are correct and morally correct. Because that doesn't feel good. It doesn't taste right to them. But why not? Well, because oppression is the whole point of oppression is it's wrong. But if might makes right, and these people get to make the rules, they're the ones oppressing the other ones, and they're actually the ones who get to make the rules. Or history is written by the victors. Same principle. You see, the problem is if you don't have an objective morality, then two people can just tell the other person what's right. And there's absolutely no way of determining which one is correct. Because we can look through history and we can say, well, certain people stood against the tide and they were the correct ones. And how do we know that? Well, they did the right thing and all of their society said the opposite. Well, that means that if that's what we're saying, that means that majority doesn't get to make the rules. There's something else that's governing what is right. Okay, well, you fast forward a little bit. So I asked the question, how do we know that that person was right versus the whole crowd? Well, because he agrees with us, essentially, would be the answer there. But how do we know that we are right? Because this is actually one of the problems that a lot of Western intellectuals face. How do we know that we're right? What if India's right? Except for their caste system, that's wrong. How do we know? It doesn't make us feel good. So ultimately, under the atheistic framework, you have a couple options. Might makes right. Whatever feels good is right. What is natural is right. Those are the three options that I can think of off the top of my head. We've talked about might makes right. And the reason that that is difficult is because because if you have two equally powerful forces and they are opposed to each other, then you have absolutely no way of determining which one is correct. So that it's unworkable. Whatever feels good. Well, lots of things feel good that are not right to do. And so that's not workable either. What about whatever's natural? That doesn't work either. And how do we know? Because, there are a lot of things that are natural that we would find morally reprehensible. To give a couple examples, infanticide is very natural. Genocide, racism, um, rape, those are all very natural things that are within our genetic heritage, and it's something that people do. And then the reason that those would be called natural is because, what's the definition of natural? Well, the definition of natural is normal human behavior. So what's normal human behavior? Well, racism is one of them. That's one. Genocide is another, as I already said. And you're like, well, no, genocide isn't normal human behavior. Yeah, it is. If you say it's not, it's because you're looking at humans in captivity. And genocide is very much normal human behavior, and rape as well. And so, what's natural is also not right. There's no real way of producing a moral framework where one person can tell the other person that they have to do something a particular way. That's an objective, normative moral framework. You just can't do that without religion, and that's why religion has a monopoly on morality. We are the producers and we are the distributors of morality. It's just a fact. And the great thing is, once we accept that fact, then we can bring in all the other things that I just mentioned. Well, might makes right. Well, we already know God's the most powerful. He's the one who created the world. He's the one who gets to make the rules. And he has the ability to enforce those rules and to punish those who work against those rules. What feels good? Well, if God exists, then we can say that when we do the right thing, it's going to feel good. It may not feel good right away in this moment, but in the end, there will be a reward. In the end, justice will be served. In the end, what feels good is going to be the good. In the end, or let's say, in the end, what is good will also feel good, even if it doesn't feel good now. And then what is natural? Well, again, the definition of natural is normal human behavior. And how do we know what normal human behavior is? Well, if we have a God who created humanity and gave us a framework, a blueprint for what normal human behavior ought to be, even if we don't see it everywhere, even if everyone seems to be doing the wrong thing, we know that normal, natural, healthy human behavior is moral behavior. So when you have God, you have all of these moral dominoes lining up perfectly. Without God, you do not. So fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of morality. And that's the fact. You shall have no other gods before me. Why? Because no other gods have the authority nor the power to produce morality. They can't write law. You shall not make for yourselves a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So, what is that? Well, I've actually mentioned this before. The image bearers of God are people. They're not idols. Idols don't bear the image of God. He doesn't dwell within them. He does dwell within people, though. And so if you are creating a carved image, then whatever you are giving to that carved image, you are stealing from someone else. If you are clothing or feeding or washing that carved image, which is what you do with idols, then you are taking that, you're stealing it, the clothing, the food, and the water from somebody else who you should be giving it to. Because how do you worship God properly? Well, if we are the image bearers of God, then the way you worship properly is by feeding, clothing, washing, visiting those who are in need. Not some idol, but people. That's why you shall not make a carved image, because God doesn't dwell within carved images. He dwells within you and the people around you. So you're giving your food to nothing, to things that are no gods. Now he says he visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me. And that is, you don't want to hate him because you're setting yourself up for what modern evangelicalism calls a generational curse. He's people are going to be punished. And why is that? Because it tells you, let's say you're being punished for something, so to speak. It tells you that there is unrepented sin that your family is suffering from. It tells you, first of all, it tells you that. Now, if God is visiting your father's iniquity on you, that's not hopeless because you can always repent of it. And then once you repent of it, you'll be forgiven of it. Why do we know that? Because the Bible says so. If you confess your sins, then he is faithful and just to forgive you of your sins and cleanse you of all unrighteousness. So not only if you repent are you forgiven, you are also cleansed of them. So those generational sins are no longer in existence anymore. The sins of your fathers can be entirely wiped off the face of your tablet. It also tells us that we are communal creatures. We are not individuals. I mean, we are essentially, but also essentially, we are one part of a community. And so if the community sins, you may bear some of the responsibility of that. And what it tells us is if the community sins and you just do nothing, you're not let off the hook. You have to actively go against sin in your community. You can't just do nothing. You can't just be quiet, because God visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation. If you fast forward to Nehemiah, for instance, the prayer of Nehemiah is, Father, I and my fathers have sinned, and please forgive us. What did Nehemiah do? Well, okay, yeah, sure, he sinned. How can he repent of the sins of his fathers? Because God visits the iniquity on the third and the fourth generation. And maybe you should be thinking about the same thing. If there are some sort of generational sins that need to be repented of, if you've already repented of them, you have absolutely no reason to continue thinking about them. But if you have not, you should think about it. But showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, there's an interesting translation question here. Thousands of what? Thousands of individuals or thousands of generations? Well, it could kind of go either way, but the way I read that is thousands of generations. And the reason is because the way that Hebrew works is it doesn't just, if there's prior context, it doesn't just invent new context unless there is new context being given. But here there is no new context. This thousands is still part of the same subject, the generation, or the same object, which is the generations. So the chesed here to the thousands goes back to this object, which are the generations. And that's just sort of how Hebrew works. That's how Greek works as well. And that really is how English works too. The problem is for us in English, this thousands represents its own noun. But in the Hebrew, and or like this right here, or the thousandth generation, that is another possible translation. But in the Hebrew, this wouldn't represent an independent noun. It would just be the dependent noun on generations, or the what's it called? It is man, I'm really messing up on my words today. It is a noun that is altering another noun, so to speak. I don't remember the word. Who love me and keep my commandments. And here you have love me and keep my commandments. These are the same thing. You can't love God without keeping his commandments, and you cannot keep his commandments without loving God. So in the New Testament, you can't keep the spirit of the law without keeping the letter of the law. And you cannot keep the letter of the law without keeping the spirit of the law. You can't do them both. When Jesus says, I say, do not, you've heard, do not lust, do not commit adultery, but I say, do not covet, do not lust after her, and that sort of stuff. The reason that that's true is not just because Jesus says it, but also because that is the letter and the spirit. It's actually, both of them are the letter of the law, but also both of them are the spirit of the law. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, what that means is, well, the word for take is like to carry. It's not really just to say, oh my God, or something like that, or even just to say the Lord's name. It includes that, though. And this is the traditional interpretation. There's a reason why all the Bibles say the Lord, as opposed to putting the Yod He Vav He in there, or Jehovah or something like that. Well, some translations use Jehovah, but in the classic translations, in the Catholic translations, in the Jewish translations, in all of the traditional and ancient translations, there is some sort of placeholder for the divine name. Why? Because all traditions view this command as, on the one hand, meaning do not use God's name lightly, because it's wrong. And it is. That's what the verse is saying. In addition to that, it is also saying, do not carry the name of the Lord your God in vain. And what that means is, do not do evil things while saying you are a Christian. Do not represent God inaccurately to your fellow peoples. It is saying both of those things. And for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. We don't understand that because we are not living in a monarchy. This is not, and the reason why, so for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. We can completely understand that for the second interpretation of this passage. If you are doing evil things in the name of God, then you are hurting other people's faith or potential faith. So it's obvious what you're doing. You are making the child stumble. You are worthy of having a millstone tied around your neck and being drowned in the depths of the sea. That's what you're doing. The first interpretation is a bit more difficult for us to understand because in the first interpretation, you're just saying a word. Why is God offended for me saying a word or a set of syllables? The reason is because he is God. He is a king. He is holy. And we don't get that because we don't have a king. But rest assured, if you have a king, then you know that there are certain things you don't say. There are certain types of clothes you don't wear. There are certain places you don't go to, and there are certain things you don't touch. There's this story in it's funny because it represents the difference between China and Japan. Essentially, both of them believed that a great dragon flew across the sky, across the land of China and Japan, and it dropped a toe on certain regions, and each one of these toes became a city. And in one version of the story, the dragon goes from China to Japan. In another version, it goes from Japan to China. But if it drops a toe, let's say in one region, and this is how many toes do? Let's assume that dragons have, let's see, 4 times 4, 16 toes. Let's just assume that they have 16 toes. Now it goes and drops its 8th toe on one city, and it becomes a city, and that city becomes the city of the 8th toe. Now in that city, only royalty are allowed to wear clothing with 8-toed dragons on it, because they are the representatives of the state, which is the 8th toe, which means the dragon, when it dropped its toe, had 8 toes left afterwards, and so therefore they are the 8th toe dragons. Now, if you walk into that city wearing a robe with an 8th toe dragon on it, then somebody comes up to you, arrests you, brings you to the king. He determines whether you are his relative or not, and if not, they kill you. Why? Because that is royal clothing, and you are impersonating a king. We look at that as Westerners, and we're like, that's crazy. Why would that be a capital offense? The people here in the Bible, look at that, and they're like, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, don't you can't say his name with just willy-nilly. He's God. God says wear tzitzit on the four corners of your garment. They're like, yeah, okay. We're part of the royal priesthood. That's what we wear as the royal priesthood. That's just what we do. That's what the royal priesthood wears. The reason that the first interpretation also makes sense is because God's a king. And we need to remember that. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So yeah, on Saturday don't work. That's what this verse means, or this command means. This is also the seal of God's authority, and there's a reason for that. There's a story. When the Enlightenment was coming and everything like that, and all the really special enlightened people were going around saying, "Oh, philosophy is great" and all that, and really we don't need all these silly old rules. Um, they decided that 7 day weeks is kind of weird. There's no rational reason to have a 7 day week. And so at one point, they're like, you know what? 10 days. Let's switch our weeks to the metric system. And so they had 10-day work weeks, and everyone hated it. And horses hated it. In fact, their beasts of burden died because they didn't operate on 10-day work weeks. And so everyone said, okay, well, let's switch to 5 day work weeks. That's half of a metric system. So let's do that. And so they did that, and it didn't work because they didn't produce anything. It just wasn't enough. And so eventually they switched back to the 7 day work week because, there's just something about it. And you know what? There is just something about it. We are designed to work for 6 days and to rest on the seventh day. That's just what we're designed to do. And not just any seventh day. You see right there, that's the definite article. And what that means is there's only one seventh day. We don't get to just make up our seventh day. There is one seventh day. Remember the Sabbath, not a Sabbath or whatever Sabbath you want, the Sabbath. What does that mean? There's only one, and it's the one that God decided exists. Remember the Sabbath that God invented to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Now, there's a lot of questions about what work means, but we'll get into that as we get a little bit further into the Bible. The seventh day is a Sabbath unto the Lord. And so this is actually one of the definitions of what it means to work. Things that are secular, you do not do. You see, the Sabbath is not a do whatever you want day. It's not that sort of day. The Sabbath is a do things unto God day. And this is why, like some people, some Messianics, they will say it's a Sabbath. Man, I don't want to go to church today. It's a Sabbath. I should just be able to, rest. And what does rest mean? It means do what I want. I get to read and make coffee or something. Just be in my robe and cozy up or whatever. Watch TV. That's not what Sabbath means. A Sabbath is a Sabbath to the Lord. So it means go to church. It means get dressed up. It means get ready. It means have your food prepared ahead of time. It means all of that stuff. It means you don't get to do just whatever the heck you want. It means do what God wants. Now, you're supposed to do what God wants all week anyway. But on this particular day, when you're resting, you're not resting for yourself, you're resting to God. And that's the point of the Sabbath, not to just do whatever you want. Not just you, but you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and your livestock, even. And even more than that, the sojourner, the stranger who is within your gates, even he shall rest. And why? Well, it's very rare when God himself appeals to creation. I think it happens like twice. But for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. So why do we keep the Sabbath? Because God made the world, all of creation, to follow the Sabbath cycle. It's not because God invented some sort of 7-day work week or whatever. And it's not because it's part of this covenant. It's not because the Jews do it. It's not because the Bible tells us to. Although, we wouldn't know about it if the Bible didn't tell us. But it's because it's how God made it from the beginning. Even if there was never a law given, we would still know that God rested on the seventh day. And so the Sabbath isn't something that you do to obey the law. You do it to obey nature, to obey God's natural order in the world that existed before any law was given. He blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy on the seventh day of the world's existence. That's the reasoning. The next one: honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So honor your father and mother, listen to what they say, obey the voice of their words, and all that sort of stuff, so that the land may be, your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. There's this thing that corrupt regimes do, and it is they sort of see people as cattle, and as cattle they cull the herd, the weak and the feeble and the elderly. You see, that's what evil, wicked, corrupt regimes do that only have a few decades left to exist. And God says, don't do that. Because how do you know you have a healthy society? It's if the unhealthy within the society thrive. So honor your father and your mother, take care of them. And if everybody does that, well, first of all, nobody has to pay for Social Security. There's that, which is what, 25%, 16% of your income. But second of all, because it's the right thing to do and it's what God commands us to do. You shall not murder. Pretty straightforward. Don't kill unjustly. There are just ways to kill. The death penalty is one of them. War is another one, if it's a just war. Self-defense, that's another one. But pretty much all other times you kill another person is wrong. You shall not commit adultery. That is, don't sleep with another man's wife. And we have expanded that today to mean don't sleep with anybody that you're not married to, which is good that we expanded that. You shall not steal. So don't take other people's belongings, and that's pretty easy. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, it's good not to lie. And Jordan Peterson has this whole thing, like one of his main things that he always says is, do not speak things that you know are false. because it causes disintegration, which is a Kierkegaardian term, which means that your it means your psyche is becoming disparate. It's parsing itself out into multiple different domains, and each of these domains are sort of hyper specializing in a way. And that leads to an unhealthy person, because if you are compartmentalizing all of your life, then you are expending an inordinate amount of energy just to keep up some sort of facade that you don't believe in. But to be integrated is to have a healthy balance in your way of thinking. So like, you're not going to be thinking in a hyper grandiose way. You are not all that great, but also you're not going to be way too hard on yourself about everything, because you're also not all that bad. You're going to have a healthy middle sort of way of thinking about everything around you. You're not thinking in terms of what will be good for you, or what would be good for the world in 1,000 years, or life is meaningless unless you can make an impact on everything for 1,000 years. Well, that's an unhealthy way of looking at things, because, well, you're probably not going to. And if you can only be happy if you do that, then you're just going to not be happy. Life is entirely meaningless for you. The opposite end of the spectrum would be just do whatever feels good in the moment. And that's also wrong. Both of those are different. In Kierkegaard's words, they're different the different forms of despair. And same with the other ones that I mentioned. And when a person goes too far into one extreme or the other, he goes into despair and he begins to become disintegrated. And the healthy person integrates himself. So when Jordan Peterson talks about that sort of stuff, he's talking about do not lie, because that leads to disintegration. It leads to despair. It leads to a multitude of unhealthy things that happen to you. What this Bible verse is saying is, when you're called up to court and someone says, someone pays you to lie about what someone did in order to get them to suffer some sort of penalty or charge, that you do it to pervert justice. That's what this verse is talking about primarily. But the other thing also is true about this verse, because you should not lie. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Now, that's interesting, because Catholics divide this into two verses, which I don't understand why, but they needed 10 commandments, and they already got rid of the first one and made these two the same. So they needed to figure out what commandment they could split into two, and this is like the only one that you could do that to. So, do not covet your neighbor's wife, or their house, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. So coveting is a heart thing. And this is one of those refutations of the sort of people that say the law dealt with your hands, but Jesus dealt with your heart. The law is dealing with your heart here. Covetousness is a heart thing. Now, what happens if you covet your neighbor's house? Well, you think that your neighbor got that house in some sort of unfair way. And you're like, no, I don't mean that. But if you're coveting their house, You're saying that it's not fair that they have it. Now, you can be jealous of their house. That's perfectly all right. You can be like, wow, man, I'm so jealous of your house. I'm going to work hard and I'm going to get something just as good. But if you covet your neighbor's house, you're saying, I want your house. I don't want you to have your house because you're not better than me. So why do you have that house? It's not fair. You see, when you covet your neighbor's house, you're saying that something is unfair about what has happened. And when you do that, you're saying that it's justifiable to take it. Same with the neighbor's wife or his servants or his ox or his donkey or anything. That is your neighbor's. If you covet their stuff, then you are going to again fall into despair. This is the entire worldview, the entire ethos of Marxism, of critical race theory, of all critical theories. It's the ethos of covetousness. That's what it is. When you divide the entire world into oppressors and oppressed, you are saying that the oppressors only got to where they are because they oppress. You're saying that there's some sort of unfair equation going on, and it's perfectly justifiable for the oppressed to rise up and take from the oppressors. That is the ethos of covetousness. And the way that you prevent that from happening is by you yourself not being covetous, you teaching your children not to be covetous, and you teaching your neighbors not to be covetous. All of that starts with you individually teaching one person, and that's enough. So those are the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off. And Moses said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." So they already said this, and God already said what they're saying is good, but now they're saying it a second time, and now Moses is saying something slightly different. Because God already said, I'm doing this. It's good that they are showing me reverence because I'm doing this to teach them to always fear and obey you, Moses, because they know that I'm speaking to you. Now he says something different. He's not saying it's good that you're fearing them, but he's saying, do not fear. For God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. So their fear now is not good. They're going a little overboard with their fear. And this is partly why Moses, sometime a little far off right now, but in this same book, comes back with a glowing face that they cannot even look at because they can't even hear the voice of God at this point. But all this is shown them so that they do not sin. And the people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold." So God is continuing the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were like the summary of the rest of the law. Love God, love your neighbor. That's a summary of the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments is a summary of all the other law. So, what is adultery? Adultery is, it will be expanded in the rest of the law to mean any sort of illicit sexual activity that the law speaks against. That's summed up in adultery. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it, which is an interesting thing to say. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it. Because, the priest wears a robe, and so you don't want to see under the robe. And that is Exodus 21. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to comment below, and please like and subscribe, and I pray that you have a good rest of your week. Have a good day. Bye.